Welcome to DriverDTrains. Thanks for stopping by. I'm your host, DriverD. Our conductor and brakeman, Scratchy-C, is still remembering that trip to Chicago. In my recent series of videos on using DCC-EX EX Rail, we developed together the rollout automations to drive our train from one end of the layout to the other and back again, using timers and sensors. In this video, the fourth in the series, we'll develop a new set of automations to control two locomotives working together to switch freight cars from one track to another. To do this, we'll learn some new ways to control our automations so they work together in tandem. Be sure to see this video's description for links to the other videos in the series, as well as a community post with all the script for today's automations so that you can try them out for yourself on your layout. Finally, if you are enjoying the videos, please leave a comment and hit the like button. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. The freight won't move itself, so let's get started. Automating two locomotives in DCC-EX EX Rail. In this video, we'll develop a set of automations to control two locomotives as they switch three freight cars from one track to another. One locomotive will set out the cars, one at a time, while the other locomotive will grab each car in turn and switch it to another siding. If you'd like to see the entire automation in action, check out my Christmas special bonus switching video, number BS2, Switching the Christmas Tree in DCC-EX EX Rail. This automation will actually consist of two automations and several sequences that work independently. We'll control these automations using timers, so we won't need to add any additional hardware to our layout, which means that you can try out the automations yourself on your layout. Be sure to check out the previous videos in this series if you'd like an introduction to or a refresher on how EX Rail automations, sequences, and aliases work. Here are all the switching moves we'll be making today. First, we'll plan out what we want our automations to do and create a new sketch for them in the Arduino IDE. Then we'll create the Spot Cars automation script for the first locomotive. After that, we'll tackle the Switch Cars automation for the second locomotive. And of course, we'll run some trains. We've got our switch list, so put on your gloves and let's go make some cuts. Automating two locomotives in DCC-EX EX Rail. Part 1. Planning our automations. Before we write our script, let's create the new blank sketch we need in the Arduino IDE and then plan what we want our automations to do. First, we'll open the command station ex.ino sketch in the Arduino IDE as we have done in past videos, and use the three dots menu at the right-hand side of the tab bar to select New Tab from the top of the list. We'll call our new sketch tab myautomation_switchcars.h with a capital A for automation, a capital S for switch, and a capital C for cars. Then we can use the three dots menu again to select the myautomation.h tab. Remember, this tab will be listed near the bottom of the menu. In the myautomation.h sketch, we'll type #include myautomation_switchcars.h to include our new sketch when the IDE compiles the DCC-EX command station code. Again, we need to make sure the spelling exactly matches the new tab we created. Now, we'll navigate back to that new tab by selecting it in the tab bar or by using the three dots menu and start planning out our automations. We'll just use comments to pencil in the broad outlines for what we want to happen. We'll start by planning out the Spot Cars automation for the first locomotive. Since this automation will start first, we'll take care of any initial housekeeping that we need to perform before the trains start running, such as setting signals and clearing the track. Then we'll work on the locomotive itself. We'll use EX rail sequences for the locomotive actions. The locomotive will start at the end of the left-hand spur on the lower siding with several freight cars coupled on in front of it. We'll use 3 cars for this example, but we can use as many as we like and have room for on the layout. Since we don't want the locomotive to simply start from a dead stop with no preamble, the first thing we will do is run a sequence to start the locomotive. In this video, I will be using Athearn Genesis 4-axle GP locomotives with Tsunami 2 sound decoders, ditch lights, and beacons, so we'll create a suitable startup sequence for those locomotives. After we run the startup sequence, we can proceed to the main sequence for the first locomotive to spot the freight cars one at a time. The real action will begin when the locomotive drives forward onto the siding and shoves the first car onto the lower right-hand spur. First, we'll make sure that any turnouts the locomotive needs to cross are set correctly. Then we'll create a sequence of events, including horns and bells, to start the locomotive moving forward. And we'll use timers to tell the locomotive how long to travel. Then we'll tell the locomotive to stop using another EX rail sequence. After a delay to allow the switchman to uncouple the cars, the locomotive will back up. We could have the locomotive back up to its starting point, but we really only need it to back up about halfway down the siding so that its train of freight cars clears the turnout and then stop. 2 car lengths should be about right. At that point, the locomotive will signal that it is time for the second locomotive to take its turn. The first locomotive will then wait for a similar signal from the second locomotive, and then repeat the process to spot the second car, making a few adjustments since it is not starting from its initial staging point. Since we backed up 2 car lengths after spotting the first car, pulling forward 3 car lengths should put the next car right where we want it. Then, after receiving the signal to spot the third car and completing that job, the first locomotive will back up to its starting point and shut down. All in all, that's pretty simple. Now let's take a look at the second locomotive. We'll call the automation for the second locomotive Switch Cars. This locomotive will start on the main line on the right-hand side of the layout. When it receives the signal from the first locomotive, it will go through the same startup sequence. Then it will begin a sequence of steps to grab and switch the first freight car. First, we'll make sure that our turnouts are set correctly. Then we'll have the locomotive pull forward on the main line, pass the turnout to the lower siding, and then stop. Then we'll throw both the turnout on the main and the one on the lower siding and back the locomotive into the spur to grab the first freight car. Next, we'll check to make sure that all the turnouts on the main are set the way we need them for our next move. After a short delay to allow the switchman to make sure the freight car is properly coupled on, the locomotive will pull out of the spur and drive down the main past the turnout to the upper siding. Then we'll stop the locomotive, throw the switch to the upper siding, and back the locomotive and freight car onto the upper spur. We don't want to go too fast. After backing a suitable distance, we'll again stop, wait, and then pull forward out of the spur and onto the main. Then we reset the switches on the main and back up the locomotive to its starting point. After that, the second locomotive will signal the first locomotive that it has completed switching the first car and is ready for the first locomotive to spot the next car. Then the process repeats. After it finishes switching the third and final car, the second locomotive will back up to its starting point and shut down. We'll then clear any signals and set the track to resume normal operations. That completes the switch cars automation. Thinking back to the example we used in the previous videos, creating our automations is like making a cake. The cake we are making today will have many layers. At the top will be the 2 automations that we will see in our throttle. On the next layer below those will be the 2 sequences that will do all the work, as well as the sequences to start up and shut down the locomotives. Below those will be the sequences that make the locomotive drive forward and reverse and stop. Finally, on the bottom layer will be the sequences that sound the horns 2 or 3 times, depending on whether the locomotive is moving forward or backing up. Now that we know what we want our automations and sequences to do, let's write the script to make it happen. Part 2. The Spot Cars Automation. Now that we have a plan, let's write the EX Rail script for the first locomotive. We will use a number of the techniques that we explored in previous videos, as well as some new ones to control the flow of our automations. For example, when we planned our automations, we identified a number of times that each locomotive would have to signal the other that it was done its job and ready for the other locomotive to proceed. We can use a virtual sensor for this, just like we did in video number 7C, adding a sensor to our automation in DCC-EX EX Rail, except that instead of the engineer triggering the virtual sensor in the throttle, the locomotives will trigger the sensor to let the other know that it is time to switch the next car. So the first thing we will need to do in our new automation is create an alias for our virtual sensor. We'll call it the spotting signal and assign it the value of 200. As always, we'll add lots of comments to explain what we're doing. Also remember that we have to explicitly define the alias values for sensors. We also know that we will be lining and throwing several turnouts or switches as the 2 locomotives traverse the layout. We'll want to create aliases for those as well, and then define the turnouts. DCC-EX offers commands for several different types of automated turnouts or switches, including DCC turnouts, motor or servo-driven turnouts, and magnetic solenoid or pin-based turnouts. Explaining how to connect all the various types of turnouts to DCC-EX is beyond the scope of this video. Moreover, I do not use automated turnouts on the D-Saver, instead operating them manually by hand. However, DCC-EX also offers a virtual turnout, which behaves in EX Rail and shows up in our throttle just like a real turnout. So for this video, we will be using virtual turnouts. Since these are virtual turnouts, we don't need to specify a specific DCC address or PIN number for each turnout. So we'll let EX Rail choose when we create the aliases. We'll create an alias for each turnout on the layout. Then we'll define the turnouts using the aliases we created. One other important thing to note is that we will be using the locomotive DCC decoder function aliases from the rollout automation that we created in video number 7B, automating a train with DCC-EX EX Rail. If you do not have that sketch tab included as part of your Command Station EX sketch, you will need to create those aliases at the top of this sketch tab where we created the spotting signal alias. You can find the necessary script with the aliases in a post on my community page. Now we can create the Spot Cars automation. We will actually split this automation into several pieces, an automation to show up in the throttle, and then several sequences to do the work spotting the cars. We'll give the automation the number 201 instead of using an alias, just in case we want to test it from the command line the way that we did when we developed the rollout automation in video number 7B. We'll end the automation with a done. Then we'll use the EX Rail unlatch command to clear the spotting signal virtual sensor so that the second locomotive does not get the idea that it is already time for it to take its turn. We also saw that the locomotives need to keep track of which freight car they are switching. The first locomotive in particular needs to travel different distances for each freight car as its train gets smaller. As I mentioned in video number 7A, creating automations in DCC-EX EX Rail, EX Rail does not allow us to use variables or counters. However, we can create makeshift variables and counters by using another EX Rail feature, virtual track blocks. By manually reserving and freeing up these virtual blocks, we can keep track of which freight car the locomotive is switching. So the next thing we will do in the Spot Cars automation is reserve the virtual track blocks we plan to use as counters so that they are ready for the start of the automation. We do this with the EX Rail reserve command. We'll reserve blocks 1, 2, and 3 for the 3 freight cars we'll be switching today. We'll free the blocks one at a time as we switch the cars. Now we're ready to start up the first locomotive. To do this, we'll create and call a new Startup Loco sequence. We'll create an alias for the new sequence and then the sequence itself. As a reminder, in this video, we will be creating a startup sequence for Athearn Genesis diesel locomotives with Tsunami 2 sound decoders. Different locomotives with different decoders would require a different startup sequence. Since we've now done this for 4 videos, I won't go into all the details about what each locomotive function does, but for this sequence, we'll start up the locomotive prime mover and wait for it to spool up. Then turn on the strobe lights, ditch lights, and headlight. We'll also remember to add delays between our function commands to make sure the locomotive receives them. Then we'll end the sequence and return to the Spot Cars automation. We have now completed all the startup actions for the first locomotive and are ready to begin the real work. First, we'll display a message on the LCD to let the engineer know that we are spotting the first car. Then we'll free the first block to let the other sequences in the automation know the same thing. Then we'll call the sequence that will actually drive the locomotive and spot the cars. We're going to make a separate sequence to do this so that we only have to write it once for all 3 cars we plan to spot. When we planned out the automation, we saw that if the locomotive pulled forward 3 car lengths, spotted a car, and then backed up 2 car lengths, it would be in the position to do the same thing again for the next car. So we'll call our sequence forward 3, back 2. We'll work on that sequence next. This sequence will do all the work driving the locomotive. We'll start with an alias, then create the sequence. Along the way, we'll create additional sequences for specific tasks that we'll repeat over and over. First, let's make sure that we line the lower right-hand turnout using the alias we created earlier. We use the EXRail close command to line the turnout for the straight route. The lower left turnout should already be set properly since we have freight cars sitting on it, and we won't be using it at all during this automation, so we won't worry about trying to set it now. Next, we'll activate the Tsunami 2 decoder's coupler sound. I hardly ever use this because it is such a boring sound that it's not worth the bother, but it doesn't take any effort to let the automation do it, so why not? We do need to add an alias for it somewhere. For this video, I will add it to the other function aliases we created for the rollout automation. I have the coupler sound set to decoder function 13, which is the factory default on Athearn Genesis locomotives. Now we're ready for the locomotive to drive forward. Throughout the automation, we are going to have both locomotives drive forward, stop, and drive backwards many times. So we will create sequences for each of these actions. We'll call these sequences Spot Loco Forward, Spot Loco Stop, and Spot Loco Reverse, although both locomotives will use the same sequences. So we'll call the Spot Loco Forward sequence to start the locomotive driving forward, and then create the sequence. As before, we'll create the alias and then the sequence. We'll turn on the bell, set the brake, and notch up the throttle. Speed step 8 should be fine for switching operations given the short distances we need to travel. Remember, we have to add a 1 to the speed step in EXRail, so we'll enter forward 9 for speed step 8. Next, we'll sound the horn 2 short blasts to indicate that the locomotive is moving forward. We'll create a sequence for this too, called Horn Forward. We'll toggle the decoder's short horn function on and off with a small delay to sound 2 short blasts, then return to the Spot Loco Forward sequence. All that's left now to get the locomotive rolling is to release the handbrake, and we're off. Now we can return to the forward 3, back 2 sequence with our locomotive driving forward. Our goal now is to get our locomotive into position where the last freight car at the far end of the train is about 3 car lengths from the end of the spur where it needs to be spotted. Because we are spotting the first car, the locomotive needs to pull forward a bit to get into that position by driving for about 2 seconds. So we need to let EXRail know that we are spotting the first car. We can do this by checking the status of the first virtual block we created to see if it is free by using the EXRail if reserved command. It's a little counterintuitive, but this command actually takes action when the virtual block is free. You may recall that we freed the first block immediately before calling the forward 3 back 2 sequence. So we'll use if reserve to check if block 1 is free, and if it is, wait or delay for 2 seconds for our locomotive to get into position. We add an end if to move on. Now we just need to wait for our locomotive to drive forward for another 3 car lengths. That takes about 16.5 seconds for my Athearn Genesis units. Then we're ready to stop the locomotive with the Spot Loco stop sequence. Let's create that. We'll stop, set the brake, and turn off the bell. Then return to the forward 3 back 2 sequence where we came from. Now we'll wait a couple of seconds, activate the coupler sound again, and wait 6 more seconds for the conductor and brakeman to finish uncoupling the freight car we are spotting. Then we start the locomotive moving backwards 2 car lengths by using the Spot Loco reverse sequence, which we'll create now. This is very similar to the Spot Loco forward sequence we created earlier. We'll again turn on the bell. This time we'll sound 3 short blasts of the horn to indicate that the locomotive is moving backward. Again, we'll do this with a sequence, this time called horn reverse. We'll again use the short horn for the first 2 blasts, but we can't use it for the third blast because the short horn is a latching function, and the next time we want to use it, we would have to remember that the function is already on and we need to turn it off. So instead, we'll sound a very short blast of the regular horn. Then we'll return to the Spot Loco reverse sequence. Now, back in the Spot Loco reverse sequence, we'll release the brake and set the throttle to reverse speed step 8 by using the EX Rail reverse 9 command. Our locomotive is moving backward, and we can return to the forward 3 back 2 sequence. Now we'll wait for our locomotive to drive backward for about 2 car lengths or 12 seconds. This is where our locomotive will stop and wait after spotting the first and second cars. However, after spotting the third car, the locomotive needs to back up to its starting point. We can again use the if reserve command, but for virtual block 3 this time, to check whether the locomotive is spotting the third car. If it is, we'll wait for an additional 14.5 seconds to let it keep backing up on the spur. We're nearly done now with the forward 3 back 2 sequence. We'll call the Spot Loco stop sequence to stop the locomotive, wait 5 seconds, and then latch the spotting signal virtual sensor to let the second locomotive know that we are ready for it to come and switch the first car. We can now return to the Spot Cars automation, where we'll wait for the second locomotive to switch the first car so that the first locomotive can spot the next car. We'll do this by using the After Spotting Signal command. This will tell the first locomotive to wait until after the second locomotive unlatches the spotting signal before the first locomotive gets back to work spotting the next car. Then we just repeat the same set of steps to spot the second and third cars. We've already written all of the sequences, so we don't need to do any of that work again. After we spot the third and final car, we don't need to wait for the second locomotive. We can just shut down the first locomotive. Again, we'll do this with a sequence. We'll turn off all the lights, shut down the prime mover, release the brake, and play some cab chatter. With that, the Spot Cars automation for our first locomotive is done. Let's take a moment to try it out. For this example, we'll use Union Pacific 643, a GP38-2 that may still be in service on the UP. We'll couple on 3 boxcars for it to spot. Because we haven't written the script yet for the second locomotive, let's temporarily comment out the 2 after spotting signal commands and instead insert a 10-second delay at those locations. That way, we can run the first locomotive through the entire automation without needing signals from the second locomotive. Then we'll upload our sketch to the Arduino command station and wait for it to reboot. There are some different ways that we can test the automation. We can use the Arduino IDE serial monitor command line and type open angle bracket /start 643 201 close angle bracket like we did in video number 7B. That will send locomotive 643 out to complete the Spot Cars automation number 201. We can also assign the locomotives to their jobs using the Y-Throttle and Engine Driver apps. In Y-Throttle, we'll select the locomotive, then go to the throttle screen and swipe right to go to the Turnout manual control screen. We can then select the route screen by clicking on the round icon with the 3 yellow dots near the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Now we select the Spot Cars automation we just created, and our locomotive will begin following the instructions we provided. We can now dispatch the locomotive to the command station and let it run on its own. We need to do this before the locomotive starts moving, because releasing the locomotive will temporarily set its throttle to 0. To dispatch the locomotive in the Y-Throttle app, we click on the green button at the bottom of the screen to go back to our locomotive roster. We then hold down the release button near the top of the screen for a few seconds. This will bring up a menu with 4 buttons. We'll click the dispatch button at the bottom, and our locomotive will now run the automation on its own. We can do the same thing in Engine Driver by selecting the locomotive from our roster, then swiping left on the throttle screen to find the route screen. We find the Spot Cars automation in the list and click Handoff. We can then go back to the throttle and select and release the locomotive. It will now run on its own through the automation. We have now completed the Spot Cars automation, which is the first half of our cake. Now let's work on the Switch Cars automation for the second locomotive. Part 3. The Switch Cars automation. Now let's work on the automation for the second locomotive. We'll give this automation the number 202 and call it Switch Cars in the throttle. Again, we'll create an automation for the top level of our cake, then a sequence to do all the work. Fortunately, we can use all the same lower level sequences to start and stop the locomotive for this automation too, so we won't need to create those again. The automation will start with the second locomotive waiting for the first locomotive to finish spotting the first car. We'll use the @spotting signal command for this. Then we'll display a message on the LCD that we are switching the first car. Since this is the first car, we'll also call the startup local sequence. Then we'll call the main sequence that will do all of the work for locomotive 2. We'll call this sequence grab car. As a reminder, for this sequence, the locomotive will pull forward on the main, back up to grab the freight car from the lower spur, pull forward down the main, and then back the car into the upper spur before retracing its steps to its starting point. So we'll start by lining or closing the turnout on the right-hand side of the main. Then we'll use the spot local forward sequence we created earlier to start the locomotive moving forward. After letting the locomotive drive for a suitable time, 15.5 seconds in this case, we'll call the spot local stop sequence to stop the locomotive. Then we'll throw the turnout and call the spot local reverse sequence to back into the spur, again for about 15.5 seconds. Then we'll stop, play the coupler sound, and wait for the conductor and brakeman to couple on the freight car that the first locomotive spotted. Now we're ready to pull on down the main. We'll make sure that the middle and left main turnouts are lined correctly, then drive forward for 26.5 seconds and stop. Then we'll throw the middle turnout and reverse into the spur. After we get the freight car partway into the spur, we'll briefly stop and then back up more slowly, going around the curve. We want to do this because we don't want to crash into any cars we previously spotted. Since we only need to do this once, we don't need to create a sequence. We'll just use the reverse 3 command to back up at speed step 2. We'll also make sure the bell is on and use the horn reverse sequence to sound 3 blasts. After we back up slowly for another 19 seconds, we'll stop and allow time to uncouple the freight car. Then it's forward and back onto the main. We'll line the middle and right-hand side turnouts on the main and back up to the second locomotive's starting point. Then we stop and set the brake. Finally, We unlatch the spotting signal to let the first locomotive know that we are ready for it to spot the next car. Then we end the sequence, returning to the switch car's automation. Now we just wait for the spotting signal to indicate that the first locomotive has spotted the second car. We update the LCD and do it all again for the second car and eventually the third car. Finally, after the last car is done, we shut down the locomotive and reset the virtual track blocks and LCD to their original state. And that marks the end of our automation. As before, we can test it out by commenting out the @spotting signal commands and inserting short delays. Then we're ready to re-upload our sketch to the command station. Then we can use the command line in the Arduino IDE or our Y-Throttle or Engine Driver apps to send the second locomotive out to switch cars. We have now completed both of our automations. We can uncomment our @ and after sensor checks and delete or comment out the delays we added for testing purposes. Then we'll upload our sketch to the Arduino one last time. And with that, we're ready to run some trains. Part 4. Let's run some trains. We now have the two automations and all the sequences we need for two locomotives to work together to switch freight cars from one track to another. Along the way, we learned some new techniques for controlling the flow of our automations so that they work together in tandem. Now, at last, we're ready, so let's go run some trains. We'll start by assigning the locomotive on the lower siding to the Spot Cars automation. Then we'll release or dispatch that locomotive and select the second locomotive that is waiting on the main to run the Switch Cars automation. Then we put on our gloves, grab our tools, and get ready to couple and uncouple cars. All aboard! If we want, we can come back later and make some changes to the automation to streamline it a bit. For example, the first locomotive could be spotting the next car while the second locomotive is still switching its car. Then the second locomotive could head straight away to grabbing that car rather than heading back to its starting point. We can also easily modify the automation by changing the timers to fit different track plans and layouts and change the number of freight cars we switch. But save all that for another time because right now we've still got 2 more freight cars waiting to be moved. What's next? DCC-EX in 2025, EX CSB1, and more. It's been 18 months since I started my series on assembling a DCC-EX command station, and a lot has changed since then. In my next video, we'll look at DCC-EX in 2025, including taking a look at the new EX CSB1, the all-in-one plug-and-play command station and booster that DCC-EX announced in December 2024. We'll also look at how to assemble a DCC-EX command station using an STM32 Nucleo board and an EX motor shield. After that, we'll look at how to add a second LCD to our DCC-EX command station and use that LCD to display information about our locomotives. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss those upcoming videos, and check this video's description for links to my other videos, including my video series on assembling a DCC-EX command station and my series on using JMRI's Decoder Pro app to control our trains. clock keeps ticking and the trains keep running. So hop on board and enjoy the ride. Until then, thanks for watching. Well, Scratchy, are you ready to get back to work? Then let's do it. All aboard!